Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. I will be joined by my colleague Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who is a partner at the firm, and Kelly will be focusing on some uniquely challenging TN visa categories in the second half of this webinar, as well as getting into a few more details about the application process. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about one of the most popular visas that our firm handles, the TN visa, which is an excellent option for nationals of Canada or Mexico to come to the US and work for a US employer. Ian Scott, the founder of our firm, actually spent some time on a TN visa, so we are both professionally and personally familiar with it, and his experience navigating the process really does inform how we work with our clients. So our firm, though we do focus on business immigration, the TN, the E2, employment, green cards, national interest waivers, etc., we are a full-service immigration firm. So we handle family immigration law, we handle humanitarian immigration law. So really any immigration questions, we hope that you won't hesitate to reach out to us. So let's go over a few housekeeping issues. At the end of this presentation, we will be following up with an email to you all. And in that email, you'll find a link where you can sign up for our future webinars. We try to do at least 2 of these a month, and usually we do many more than 2 webinars a month, and those cover, again, the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So please do sign up for those and join us if they are helpful to you. We'll also share a link to our YouTube channel. So this webinar is being recorded, and we do tend to post our recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. We also include shorter videos on our YouTube channel. So really we try to put high quality information, obviously for free, on our YouTube channel. So do check that out. We will also be including in that email a comprehensive TN visa guide, and we collect really the best information we have. It's a very comprehensive guide, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. We hope it's helpful to you. If you have questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to send them in. You can use either the Q&A function on Zoom or the chat function, and I will be actively monitoring those. We will probably save questions for the end of the webinar, but don't hesitate to send them in during the presentation. I'll be monitoring them. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll do that by talking first about the TN visa requirements. To qualify for a TN visa, you do need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. And the requirement is only that you have a passport from one of those 2 countries. You don't actually need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. What's relevant is that you have a passport from the country. You need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer in one of a number of listed professions. Those professions are listed in the TN regulations. And it may be helpful at this point, if you're at your computer, to go ahead and pull up those regulations. If you Google TN NAFTA, NAFTA regulations, one of the first links that comes up should be 8 CFR section 214.6, and that is where the regulations are for the TN visa. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you will see a list of occupations, starting with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst, all the way through to veterinarian, zoologists, various scientific and teaching categories. So there really are dozens of TN professions, and Kelly and I will be referring to the TN regulations throughout this presentation, so it might be helpful for you to have those up on your computer as we're going through this. So you need to be coming to the US to work for a US employer in one of those listed professions. You need to qualify for the specific profession that you're coming to the US to practice. So if you go back to those regulations and you look at any of these professions, let's take, for example, accountant. You need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license. If you look down at economist, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. You cannot qualify as an economist based on some professional license that you might have. You do need that bachelor's degree. Whereas as an accountant, you can qualify if you have the professional license, even if you somehow don't have the undergraduate degree. So when I say you need to qualify for the profession, that is specific to the TN regulations. What do the TN regulations say you need to qualify for the profession? I'm not talking about what you need to qualify for the profession in your home country or even in the US. This really is specific to the TN regulations. And you actually do need a job offer. So the TN visa is not to come to the US and search for a job or interview and apply for a job. It really is once you already have that job offer in hand and you're coming to the US to actually fill that position. And finally, in that position in the US, you actually need to be performing the job duties that are associated with that occupation. So this might sound like common sense, but it actually does come up quite a bit. So for example, if you're coming to the US and the company that's going to employ you really wants you to work on their social media campaign. You're really good at Facebook and using TikTok and Instagram to promote companies. Unfortunately, there's not really a good TN category for you to do that. So some people will say, well, what if I apply, I have a bachelor's degree in economics. Could I apply as an economist and do this social media campaign? The answer is no. You actually do need to come to the US to practice the job duties in that profession. We'll talk a lot more about how you figure out what those job duties are, but in short, you would look at the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Outlook Handbook, which is their publication of what the job duties associated with a given profession are. So one of the most common questions we get from people who are considering a TN visa, and oftentimes employers as well, is whether the TN visa requires sponsorship. And the short answer to this question is no. The TN visa does not require sponsorship, but let's actually talk about the definition of sponsorship. Well, what is even meant by that? When people ask about sponsorship in the US immigration context, they're usually talking about what they have in mind for, say, an H-1B visa, an L visa, or an employment-based green card. So in the context of non-immigrant and immigrant visas, sponsorship is really when an employer has certain requirements toward the employee and even toward other US workers that they have if they're going to hire a foreign worker. So for example, if someone's applying for an employment-based green card, they may need to test the US labor market. They might need to advertise the job, see if anyone applies. They might need to apply to the US Department of Labor to figure out what they can pay, called the prevailing wage. The employer might be obligated to not what's called bench the employee. So if the employee is in the US, the employer has to put them in active work and has to pay them. They can't say, hey, you know what, we don't have a position for you for a few weeks. They have to employ the worker. They may need to pay for the worker to go back to their home country if the position is terminated. None of those requirements applies to a TN visa. Okay, a TN visa, really the employer's obligations to employ the employee on a TN visa are the same as they are to any other employee. And what I mean by that is the employer obviously has to pay minimum wage, local minimum wage, state and federal minimum wage, and they have to abide by typical labor and employment laws. But other than that, there really are no additional requirements that come with a TN visa. So a TN visa really is the most streamlined, basic work visa for someone to come to the US. And again, if someone comes to us and is a national of Canada or Mexico, it really is going to be one of the first things we consider if they're looking to work in the US. But what is required of the employer beyond the minimum wage? Really, it's just providing a letter to the employee that explains what the job offer entails. So that means that the employer needs to explain what position the person is going to fill, and specifically what TN occupation they'll be filling, what their job duties are, what they'll be paid, how long the employer intends to pay them. Typically, that would be fewer than 3 years, since that's the limit on the TN. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And really just lays out who the company is and who the applicant is. Is that letter enforceable? We have not seen the government move to enforce that letter. Really, the employee, once they come into the US, they're an at-will employee. So if it turns out that the employer needs to fire the TN worker, they have the right to do that. And conversely, if the TN employee decides to quit, they can do that as well. They have that right. So the employee really is at will if that's consistent with the terms of the employment agreement. So there is no required wage among minimum wage. TNs are not location specific, so if you do have multiple offices in the US as the employer, you can move a TN worker between those locations. Now, one small distinction is, and Kelly will get into more details on this. There are a few options to apply for a TN visa. In general, you can apply at a port of entry or a consulate or USCIS from within the US. Nationals of Mexico don't have the option to apply at a port of entry. The distinction in the context of sponsorship is that if the TN employee is already in the US in another status, say they're a student and they want to apply for TN status to work for an employer, and they don't want to leave, so they would apply through USCIS for TN status. We call that a change of status. The employer would file that application. It's called the Form I-129, and the supporting documents would be included with that, proof that the person qualifies for the role, for example. And that is an exception where the employer would have to sign the forms. So there is that additional requirement on the employer if the employee is applying for a change of status. But that really does not create any additional responsibilities other than obviously being honest in the application. It doesn't create the obligations associated with sponsorship. So I did want to mention that small caveat. If the employee is applying at a port of entry, if they're Canadian, or if they're applying at a consulate, if they're nationals of Canada or Mexico, then the employee, the individual, is submitting the application. So the only thing the employer would provide is that employment letter that I mentioned before. So I've already gotten into this topic a bit. What are the differences for Canadian and Mexican nationals who are applying for a TN? Canadians can apply for a TN at a port of entry, so that means an airport or a land crossing. Nationals of Mexico cannot. So this is actually a huge benefit for Canadians just because it is such an easy option. All they have to do is, if they're in the US, they'd leave the US. If they're not in the US, they'd travel into the US either by driving or at an airport. And when they enter, they would communicate to the CBP, Customs and Border Protection Officer, that they want to apply for a TN visa. And they would have their application materials with them. The border officer would review those materials, ask some questions about what position they're trying to come in to work in, how they're qualified. They'd look at that employer letter. And if they're approved, then right there, the CBP officer will permit them to enter the US. And as soon as they enter, they're in TN status and would be able to start working. Typically, Canadians are given status for 3 years when they enter. If they leave and come back in, then they would communicate to the officer that they have been approved already and that they are re-entering the US to continue employment for the TN employer. The option to apply at a consulate is available to Canadians. It is rarely used just because the port of entry option is so easy. But some cases in which we do see Canadians use the consulate are when they are married to someone who is not a citizen of Canada, or they have a child who's not a citizen of Canada. If that's the case, then that dependent, spouse or child, would need to apply at a consulate. So if that happens, oftentimes the principal applicant would also want to apply at the consulate along with the dependent. So nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. They don't have the option to apply at a port of entry. They would file the DS-160 online and be called into the consulate for an interview. At the interview, they would provide their supporting documentation and would really engage in a similar interview that CBP would engage in, asking about the role, how they're qualified, etc. Nationals of Mexico have the option to receive a visa for either 1 year or 4 years. They would have to pay an additional fee for the 4 year visa validity period, but more often than not, we would recommend that they do so. It's just so convenient to not have to go back to the consulate year after year and have a visa that's valid for 4 years. When the Mexican national enters the US, just like Canadians, they're given TN status for 3 years typically. The exception to that is if the role is shorter. So if you're coming to the US to work, say as a management consultant for only a year, CBP is not likely to give you status for longer than a year. And of course, that makes sense. For Mexican nationals, sometimes the consulate will allow, if you're applying to renew your TN visa, will allow the renewal to be done through mail, but the consulate would communicate that once you've submitted the application. We'll get into a few more details. Kelly will in the second part of this presentation, and for now, I will pass it off to her to talk with some particularly tricky TN categories.
Thank you, Dustin. Perfect. So we're going to talk about a couple categories that are kind of widely used, but also heavily scrutinized, and kind of the reasons for that additional scrutiny. So one category is the management consulting category. And this category is used very frequently, partially because it does not require a degree. You can qualify, either by having a relevant degree or with 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to a consulting agreement in the United States. So this category is really heavily scrutinized, partially because it is often used as a catch-all. Like if somebody wants to bring in a sales director or a general operations manager or something like that, and there's really not a TN category that is available for those types of roles, sometimes they will try to fit that into a management consultant TN, and the government is aware of that. And so that means that when they're looking at these applications, they really want to see that it does fit into what a management consultant is supposed to do, which means either that you are going to work for a management consulting firm, for example, Boston Consulting Group or Deloitte, or any firm that provides those management consulting services, or that you are being brought in as a temporary consultant. And in that case, it really needs to be you're not being brought in as a full-time employee in a role that is normally within kind of the organizational chart of the company. And a management consultant is meant to be a role that's outside of that, that's temporary, someone who's coming in to look at operations, to make recommendations to management, to write reports. So it's when you're thinking about whether or not a management consulting TN can work, you do want to be aware of that, just that they will scrutinize it very heavily. And these are the types of cases where often it is very beneficial to work with an attorney to help frame the application and explain both to the employer, what the restrictions are, to see if there really is a possibility for this to fairly qualify as a consulting role. For example, if it's a company who's bringing in a consultant who has 5 years of experience in a particular area, that can work, but you do need to be, thoughtful about how you prepare the application, what the time scale is for the consulting agreement, what the deliverables are. So it's really clear to the officer that you're not trying to kind of fit something that really should not be under the management consulting category into this category. The other category that is very heavily scrutinized is the economist category. And the reason for this is that this category used to be used much more broadly to encompass people coming in as economists, but also people who were coming in to do financial analyst work and people who were coming to do market research analyst work. There was a new policy memo in November of 2017 that significantly narrowed the scope of the economist category, and explicitly excluded both market research analysts and financial analysts from qualifying under this category. So anyone who was on a market research analyst TN did need to find another option, very quickly. For financial analysts, it's a bit more complicated just because it can be very nuanced to draw a line between what economists do and what financial analysts do. It's relatively clear that the work of a market research analyst is very different from that of an economist. But for a financial analyst, I think it is much more malleable. It's much harder to kind of, draw that exact line. So it is something where if someone is in a financial analyst role, depending on kind of is there flexibility in changing the job a bit, or what is the person's degree say? Did they take, courses in in economics? So there, or there's something that you need to think about when you're preparing these types of applications. But it is important to just keep in mind, particularly if you are someone who got a TN previously as a market research analyst or financial analyst, that's not going to work anymore under the economist category. And you would need to kind of look for a job, that more specifically fits, with the duties of an economist. And generally to figure that out, you look at the Department of Labor websites, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Occupational Outlook Network, which provide a lot of detail about what are considered normal job duties for an economist. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about the TN application process. I know Dustin covered some of this earlier when we talked about the differences between Canadian and Mexican nationals. So for Canadians, they have the ability to apply at any port of entry, ports of entry that are in Canada, into the US, also, from Mexico. Or other ports of entry. Generally, you're going to provide a job offer letter, supporting documentation, with your proof of citizenship in Canada. So you do have to have a Canadian passport. It's not enough to be a permanent resident of Canada to qualify. You do need that passport, and then proof of your educational and professional qualifications. So your certified transcripts, the original of your diploma, a copy if you absolutely can't get it, but definitely you should have those certified transcripts from your school. And the job offer letter should also be an original, with an original signature on it. There are some ports of entry that are just very, very strict about that. So you don't want to be denied on something very simple, such as just having a copy, when if you had the original, would have been approved. There are some ports of entry that are particularly optimized for TN processing, and Customs and Border Protection does recommend that you go to those optimized ports, particularly if you're a first-time applicant for a TN. It's a good idea as well to call the ports ahead of time to see if they have, an appointment system or a particular time, when you should visit. Particularly during COVID, some ports of entry change their procedures. They put in an appointment time. And by calling ahead, it ensures you're going to be coming at a time when you're going to get an officer who understands, the TN visa process. So that can certainly be helpful, when you're applying for the TN. The benefit of going as a Canadian is, you go to the port of entry and you present the documentation. And if the case is approved, they will, they'll write the TN visa stamp into your passport, enter it into their system to show that you have that TN. And then you can go ahead and enter the US and start working. The earliest that you can apply for your TN at the port of entry is 10 days prior to the start date. So you do want to look at your offer letter, the letter provided by your employer. What are the proposed start dates? You cannot just go, 2 months in advance, get the TN and come back to Canada. You do have to, they do make it so that you can only enter within that 10-day period. So for Mexican nationals, they need to apply at a consulate. So this involves filing, Form DS-160. You have to pay a visa application fee. You have to go do biometrics, so photos and fingerprints, and actually attend a consular appointment with, a consular officer who will take a look at the documentation and then interview you to ensure that you are eligible for the TN. The documents you need to bring are the same ones, that are relevant for, Canadian nationals, but then you would also need to bring your DS-160 confirmation page, your visa, fee receipt, your, appointment page showing that you have an appointment with the consulate. And so, one benefit, one very good change that happened recently is that Mexican nationals can now pay a slightly higher reciprocity fee, and they can either get a 1-year visa under the lower reciprocity fee or a 4-year visa stamp under the higher reciprocity fee. Although it is good to keep in mind that even if you have a 4-year visa, the maximum admission you can ever get as a TN visa holder is 3 years. So even if you have a 4-year visa, when you enter the US and you check your I-94, if it says 3 years, that is the appropriate, maximum time that you could get on the TN. One thing that they've started doing more and more, particularly because of COVID, is ability to renew by mail. So this is something where if you don't have any kind of issues in your prior immigration history and you meet certain requirements, like you're renewing within a certain timeline, then you may be able to just mail in your passport and your documents and not have to attend an appointment at the consulate. Something to keep in mind, though, is that they cannot issue visas to people who are physically in the United States. So it does require you to travel to Mexico to take advantage, of these, this renewal process. And then another option that's available both to Mexican nationals and Canadian nationals is to apply with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services within the United States. So in this instance, your employer is actually going to file something called Form I-129 with the government. They'll file it with all the supporting documents that we just talked about. And then if you get the approval, you would need to wait for the approval to start working. So sometimes, particularly during COVID, when people couldn't get appointments at the consulate or they were nervous to go to the border, or just travel was not a possibility, many people would perhaps extend their status, renew with, USCIS. However, very often, because people are wanting to travel, they prefer to go to the border or to the consulate initially. If you do get an approval with USCIS, and you're Canadian, you can take that to the border. You can present that along with your other documents, as evidence that you should be granted kind of the TN visa to be able to travel. So we can move to the next slide. Let's talk about some tips and then some common, TN visa pitfalls. One I think I mentioned already is you want to call ahead to the port of entry, particularly if you've never been to the port of entry before, or it's been several years since you've been there. Definitely call ahead. Good to find out just what are their procedures, what is the timeline going to be like, just to make sure that you can, plan appropriately in terms of how early to get there for your travel, and make sure, for example, if you're in an airport, you're not going to, miss your flight or have issues with that. Another thing is you want to ensure that the employer contact who signed the letter is available, and is aware of when you're going to the border and would be able to pick up the phone. And if the officer has any questions, about the company or about the role, that they're familiar with your application and able to answer those questions. You definitely want to make sure that that person knows that they could be contacted by a government official and has read the TN letter and can reflect back to the officer, what the job duties and responsibilities are as outlined in that TN letter. They will sometimes also, Google the company, particularly if it's a very small company. So usually, having some type of web presence is important, just so they, understand that it's a legitimate company. Definitely you want to bring your diploma, your official transcripts, the original signed version of the employer letter. It seems like a very minor thing, but it is something where the officer may deny you based on not having the original letter. So you do want to just make sure that even though, the document requirements for a TN are very light compared to many other visa types, you do want to make sure that you have all of these, these things ready, because they will potentially deny you if you don't have the original signature. So another thing to consider is the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. It does require a showing of non-immigrant intent. You should be prepared to show ties to your home country. It's not something that you would need to kind of prepare in your packet and hand to the officer, but you should have it with you. And in case the conversation kind of goes in that direction, which sometimes it can, particularly if you've been in the US, maybe you're renewing the third time and now you've been in the US for 9 years, or if you've been in the US with the same employer for all that time, they may start to have more questions about what are your future plans? What are your ties to Canada? And so you do want to be prepared to discuss that. If you have financial accounts, retirement accounts, if you own property, if you have family members in Canada, those are all important things to be able to kind of discuss. And then you want to have the supporting documents to back it up. But the officer is also going to be most concerned with kind of having that dialogue with you and feeling like, your answers are credible and make sense. So that is something to keep in mind with the TN. If you are in a position where you're starting to think about getting a green card, it may be a good idea to discuss with your employer as to whether they're able to enter you into the H-1B lottery, or look for some other, visa type that has kind of a lower standard for non-immigrant intent, because the standard for the TN to show non-immigrant intent is relatively high in comparison to some other non-immigrant visa types. So I
Perfect.
think that's
Thank you,
it.
Kelly. Yeah, so that was a great segue. We did get a question about ties to the home country, so I think you answered that very thoroughly. Let's move on to some of the other questions that came in. We did get some good ones. One of the things that we didn't talk about much is what a dependent spouse or child can get. So, um, Kelly, do you want to say a little bit about the TD visa and how a family member who wants to work in the US can pursue that option?
Sure, absolutely. So unfortunately, TD dependents, that includes your spouse and any unmarried children under 21. Um, they are permitted to come to the United States with a TN visa holder. They are permitted to go to school, but unfortunately, they are not permitted to work. So if you have a spouse who's, a TD visa holder and they do want to work in the United States, they would need to look for a different visa type. So, for example, if they would qualify for their own TN, or if there's some other visa type that's available to them. For Canadian and Mexican nationals, the E2 investor visa is an option if they're, have an entrepreneurial bent or want to work in that way. They could also, if they have an employer in the US, perhaps look at the H-1B visa or the L-1 visa if they've been working for a company, in Canada abroad and going to be transferred to the United States. But unfortunately, there is no ability to get that work authorization as a dependent. They would need to look on their own for a different visa that would allow them to work in the United States.
Perfect. And we got another question about something that I had intended to talk a little bit more about, which is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So Kelly mentioned the Occupational Outlook Handbook, which we also call the OOH, is published by the U.S. Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it covers really I don't know how many professions, possibly hundreds of professions in the US. And what it does is it basically is the government's representation of what the US government thinks people do in a given occupation, how much they think those people should be paid, how they think people in that profession can qualify for that profession, whether by degree or a professional license. So the question that came in is the OOH considered the Bible for the immigration officer when looking at roles and responsibilities in an application? Um, I wouldn't put it in those terms. What I would say is that the OOH is persuasive. An officer is not obligated to agree with the OOH. Um, Officers do tend to have complete discretion over applications. So if they feel you should be doing something differently or qualify in a different way, frankly, at the end of the day, they tend to have the power and authority to make that choice. And you can always ask for a supervisor if you disagree, but oftentimes a supervisor will defer to the officer. But what I will say is that the OOH is certainly persuasive. So what we oftentimes do in applications is we'll quote from the OOH. For example, if we have a client who say is applying for a role as an economist, and they have a degree in finance, but they've taken many courses in economics, then we might quote the OOH that says that economists can have a degree in a related field. Another example where the OOH is really key is when you're looking, or when the U.S. employer is looking at what your job duties in the U.S. will be. It's always a good idea to make sure that your job duties in your profession are consistent with what is listed in the OOH. So if you are coming to the US to work as an accountant, for example, um, talk with the US employer, see what job duties they want you to perform, and then go to OOH. And if it looks like the job duties the employer wants you to perform are substantially different from what's in the OOH, have that discussion with the employer and see if and this needs to be honest, of course, it's not simply framing. But you do want to make sure you're coming to the US to perform job duties that are similar to what's in the OOH. And last point is, I'll just quickly add that one of the things we do with some regularity in TN applications is have those discussions with the employer. So an immigration lawyer is not only helpful in preparing the visa application, but also explaining to the employer what are the requirements of a TN visa application and how can you create a strong application versus a weak one. And this is a really good example of how we do that in terms of looking into the OOH and helping the employer craft those job duties so that they're consistent. Kelly, an interesting question came in that I'm curious to get your take on. The TN management consulting category, which you talked about, the question is whether someone can use that category for someone who is a team building professional. So let's assume that they qualify for the management consulting category because they've been working as a team building professional for 5 years, and they want to come into the country on a TN to run a team building event. How would you think about that application?
Yeah, I think this is a borderline. This would be kind of a borderline case, I think. Just in the thought of, like it would really depend on kind of what is the person actually coming in to do. This would be the type of situation where I would strongly recommend if you're interested in pursuing this, setting up a consultation with us, because whether or not it's a viable TN is really going to be in the details of what is the person coming to do? What are the deliverables? How long is the person coming for? What's the payment structure? Do they have their own consulting company where they're going in and doing this, with other companies? So this is the type of case where it's definitely not a straightforward management consulting case. And you would, I think, want to work with an attorney just because it would be about figuring out, is there an ability to look at what this person is doing, what their, like educational or, work history is, and then match that with what, a management consultant is coming in to do, because management consultants generally are going to come, observe, observe operations, make recommendations based on that, develop solutions. So for example, if someone was coming in for one day for, a team building event, just to meet with everybody and do trust falls. And, it's really just going to be in the details. So I think, possibly, definitely, possibly could be like, let's assume the person's coming in, they're going to work with the team for a couple of weeks. They're going to see how the team interacts with each other. Then, the event that they're going to run is going to be based on recommendations they make to management about ways that the team could be, made to work more efficiently together. I think in that type of scenario, you're going to have, a stronger type of case, but it will be the type of case where the applicant, is going to, and the employer is going to need to be able to kind of advocate for what they're doing, because you could get an officer that really does, doesn't look straightforward, doesn't look like a management consulting case. And you want to make sure that if you're structuring, if there is flexibility in how to structure the way that you're doing the team building event, that it could be structured in such a way that it would make sense to qualify as a management consultant.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. And since we do have additional time, I wanted to make a few very quick points. And if there are any other questions, feel free to send them in. Kelly mentioned that if you have a management consulting company, which is an interesting point, you are able to own the foreign employer. So if you say have your own management consulting company based in Canada, you can come into the US on a TN if there's a US company that wants to hire your Canadian company and your Canadian company is sending you to do the work. That is possible, but you cannot own the US employer. So if you've started a company in the US, say a management consulting company in the US, you cannot get a TN visa to work for that company. You can't own the US employer. Also, a couple other just common questions. The TN visa can be used for part-time employment. And the TN visa can be used for concurrent employment. So let's say you're working part-time for two different companies. You can get TN authorization to work for both. The one important thing to keep in mind there is that you do need to have permission. So you do need to either wait for USCIS to approve the I-129 for both employers, or you need to actually enter the US through a port of entry or go to the consulate and get approval for the concurrent two TN employers. You cannot be in the US working for one TN employer and then another company wants you to work for them and you just start working for them. You can't do that. You do need to wait for the government to give you authorization. Unauthorized work can be a big problem, so we don't want anyone to run afoul of those regulations. All right, I think that's all we had. We got through the questions. Thank you all for the active participation and the great questions. Kelly, thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise. Everyone, please do keep an eye out for our email. Sign up for future webinars, visit our YouTube channel, and of course, reach out to us for a consultation if we can be helpful at all. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.